Indigenous curriculum and content into their courses. I'm not an instructional designer, so I don't build courses, but I help assist in that development process that faculty go through as they're prepping for their courses. So today I wanted to start off as well with a land acknowledgement, just acknowledging the places and spaces that we find ourselves in. For me, being from Tyendinaga, I'm from Tyendinaga, but I recently moved about 20 minutes off reserve, so I'm closer to Belleville now where I am. So the land that I'm situated on today is a shared land amongst three groups. So the Haudenosaunee peoples, the Anishinaabe peoples, and the Wendat peoples. So that's kind of where I'm finding myself right now. But when I think about land and kind of our connection and sharing with land and what that means, to me, it's a very deep connection. As a Mohawk woman, my connection to the land is very much rooted in my framework and my ways of knowing, my ways of understanding things. We think of land and creation and all those aspects of things that were given to us by Creator to sustain our life here on Earth. So when I think about land, I think about gratitude. I think about paying my respects and giving thanks every single day for all aspects of creation. So in my framework and from my cultural understanding, we often open and close our day with the Ohondongarawe, which is a Thanksgiving address, or known as the words before all else. So before you get started with your day, before you get started with your task at hand, and also before you end your day, you should always give thanks to all aspects of creation and all elements of the world that we have, so that you're constantly having a positive mindset and a positive mind frame as you go about your business, and then as you close your business down for the day and head off to sleep. So that's something that I think right now during these times we should all kind of be shifting and thinking about our gratitude, our attitude of gratitude. Mohawk peoples have been doing that from the beginning of time. It's kind of built into our culture and our ways of being. But in these times when it's a little bit more stressful with the pandemic going on and things like that, it's so much more important to have that mindset and to focus on, even if you can just find one moment, one thing in your day that you're grateful for, the more you're able to recognize those things, those small things, and give thanks, the more you realize how much you actually do have, and that your life is beautiful and abundant, even though sometimes it feels like it might not be. So that has been very helpful for me to rely on that framework. So I wanted us to get started. So what I'll do is I'll pass it over to my co-facilitator, Klodiana, to introduce herself, and then we'll get right into things, okay?
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you for that beautiful reminder and starting our session with gratitude. I see some familiar names here, and that's absolutely fantastic. I miss seeing you in person. But for those who don't know me, I'm Klodiana Kolomitro, and I'm the Director of Education Development for the Faculty of Health Sciences in the Office of Professional Development Education Scholarship. That role includes faculty development for health sciences and also interprofessional education. And I know most of the names here because I've been in this position. Oh, Maggie, I'm sorry you can't see me. There is something probably with my camera, wrong with my camera. But I've been in this position for only a year. Prior to that, I was in the Center for Teaching and Learning for 7 years. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And before we move even further, I would like to acknowledge my own positionality as a cisgendered, able-bodied, white scholar, but also acknowledging the privilege that comes with that. I'm fully aware and mindful of the privilege and the responsibility that I have because of that privilege. At the same time, I do want to say that I'm fully committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is an area that I've been engaged in research, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to share those findings with you soon. We were able to interview and survey graduate students at Queen's to understand their perceptions of when they feel included. What does it look like? What does it feel like? And that publication is coming. The other part is my recent commitment and recent membership with the UCARE committee, the University Committee of Anti-Racism and Equity. so that the work there connects quite well with what we'll be sharing with you today. So you will see a combination of our own practices. You'll see a combination of what we actually do in the classroom ourselves as teachers and educators, but also what the scholarly literature says. And trust me, there has been a lot of publications in the last 2 months in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'll start with this article that a colleague of mine from the Human Rights and Equity Office and myself published the University Affairs, and we called it "Online Learning Isn't as Inclusive as You May Think." And this was back in 2018. So from 2018, when I think about online learning and what it looked like, and when I think about what's happening now, how we've moved to this new norm, online learning has become a new norm, then lots of things have changed. What hasn't changed, though, the one thing that hasn't changed is what students need and want, their desires, their aspirations, and their interests. And what hasn't changed is that students still want and need a sense of place and a sense of belonging. So where is my place and who are my people? And part of it, don't get me wrong, part of it is the discipline and the content and the culture within the discipline, or the microculture within the discipline. But the other part is being in that community where they feel they're being cared for, they feel they're being included, and they feel that the learning is actually complementing their current life situation there, rather than complicating it. So all that to say that when we think about inclusion and inclusive design, we think about generally 3 different areas: that students have equal access to learning, they feel valued, and they feel supported in their pursuit of knowledge. I mean, I should mention here that inclusion, the term itself, has also been criticized because it focuses sometimes on who has the power to include or not in some cases, and who can disrupt, or how can we disrupt these historical patterns or of unequal power distributions. And this is why we've added that second definition there, that inclusive design actually seeks to change the way systemic inequities operate in teaching and learning spaces and affect the individual experiences in education, but also at the same time influence curriculum design. So as you think about inclusive teaching, and I know, again, there are different terms that are being used. Some of it is, some people, I hear them using the term culturally responsive teaching, which to me is 2 sides of the same coin, but there are some differences. Inclusive design thinks and takes into consideration access, support, and the feeling of being valued, and that sense, creating and cultivating that sense of belonging. At the same so asks and invites us as educators to think about what are some of the systemic inequities that are present in teaching and learning spaces. And at the end of the day, if I had to provide a simpler definition of inclusive teaching and inclusive design, it's really about creating that mindset and asking yourself the question, who is being left out by the decisions that I'm making as an educator and as a faculty member. So even in the, or as a graduate student, as a scholar in general, even earlier on, I know, I'm sure all of you felt that way, but back in March when we all moved to remote delivery and remote teaching and learning, we had to make some very quick decisions about what components of our course were going to be synchronous, which parts were going to be asynchronous, how we're going to engage students, and so on. And the list goes on and on and on. But again, in every single question that I've posed myself, in again building my own course and creating my own course online, was who am I leaving out by making this decision or deciding to include this assignment and not another one. So for the rest of the session, you will see us go deeper into some of the strategies that could help create, again, that feeling of belonging, that community of care and pedagogy of care, but also ensuring that students have equal access to learning.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm just going to add to that, Klodiana.
Yeah.
I like how you started out your introduction with identifying your own positionality, where you stand as a scholar, as an instructor, and as someone leading this group. So you talked about your privilege, you talked about your own background. I think that's a great practice to get into doing with your students as well, is just really letting them know your positionality, what your background is culturally, where you're coming from in your teaching philosophy, and then being explicit when you're trying new teaching and learning frameworks or techniques that are outside of your comfort zone or your cultural framework or understanding. And then also just being aware of your own well-being of yourself in a holistic way, so emotional, spiritual, physical, mental aspects of being, and then modeling that for your students, that you're willing to take care of yourself in that way, but you also want them to take care of themselves and each other as well, and create that inclusive and community that's committed to everyone's well-being and everyone's safety. So really being vulnerable and brave with your students, and also just sharing that with them when you're trying something new, that it might be at first uncomfortable, but that you're trying it out for the purpose of inclusion and making everyone feel safe and trying something new together, learning together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we'll come back to the idea of modeling and how are we as instructors modeling inclusive ways of being, knowing, and practices, and when do we know? When do we know when we're being inclusive?
So this next exercise, we're hoping that you can actually jump in the chat and just give us some suggestions on how do you know as an instructor when you're being inclusive. So I'm being inclusive online when I see, hear, feel, something like that. So something along those lines, just share maybe a sentence or a quick point with us in the chat. We'll give you a few minutes to kind of do that, and then we can take up anything that is worth expanding on, or we have something to add to it, and then we'll move on to the next slide. But it's a nice way to think about that individually, but then maybe share that collectively so we can each learn from each other. Okay, so there's some great responses coming in. I see about participating in ways that you feel comfortable, Bobby. I think that's comfort is so huge, especially for more reserved students or students, even international students or students that are coming back to the university environment for the first time, mature students. Comfort in the classroom is huge. Concerns, fears, and leading your students through those with flexibility and empathy. Good one, Kate. I think those are two approaches that I've taken as well with my students, and they're just so important for making them feel safe and making them feel supported along the journey, and specifically in this instance where we had to switch pretty rapidly to flexible delivery options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent comments and excellent strategies that people are using already, and I'm just trying to read some as well. So when students participate fully, so when they're fully engaged and meaningfully engaged, and the participation will look differently for different students, and we'll get into that a little later. Trust, absolutely. There is so much to be said about building that trust, and that came up in some of my research as well, building that trust and students feeling that you have their best interest in mind. Yeah, excellent comments.
Great. Awesome. Okay. You can continue on with typing if you'd like, but we'll move on to the next slide so we can keep things moving.
Yeah, absolutely. Please keep on typing. Excellent strategies there. I just want to check again if you can all share. Can you all see my screen? Lindsay, is my screen on?
Yep, it's good.
Perfect. Excellent.
Okay, so this one is showing different ways of considering right from the syllabus, the very first part that most people begin to think about their course when it comes to this time to create the syllabus, and then moving through to step 6, which is kind of classroom climate. So I'll go through each of these. So with the syllabus, how does your syllabus demonstrate your approach towards differences? Does it include guidelines on creating an accountable learning environment? Does it include the territorial acknowledgement or land acknowledgement? And is that meaningfully incorporated or spoken either within the first weeks or throughout the course? And then moving into the course itself, so who is included in your reading list? Does it include diverse voices with particular attention to those from equity-seeking groups? And then how do you uncover the colonial aspects of your course or your discipline? So that's a question I get asked often is, how do I decolonize my course? Well, the first step is always to figure out what's colonial about it, whose voices are being privileged, what content is being shared, what case studies are being represented, and what groups within those case studies are being represented. So thinking about those things, and then thinking about ways where you can add variety and add some more perspective into your course design. And then third is students. So who are the learners that will be in your class? Who will not be there? Thinking about absences as well as presence. And then how will you find out your students' characteristics? So you could, including their needs, their interests, their aspirations. So you could lead a variety of activities in the first class or the first few weeks to get to know them. So I've seen some faculty do get to know you surveys, and they send that out to their students, or they'll provide a video introduction of themselves and hope that will encourage the students to share as well. I've done co-created learning classroom community commitments with my students. So I've done it through a crafting exercise where we made wampum agreements, beaded keychains, and they had a chance to say how they wanted our classroom community to feel and how we wanted to support each other and kind of classroom rules. And it provided a way of classroom management, but also just making them responsible for the learning environment as well as myself. So really that shared feeling of community that we were able to build on and develop after that first initial couple of weeks. And then content, so thinking about what absences and presences in terms of content too, so as well as margins, different worldviews, perspectives, and what voices inform your selection of course content. So thinking about your own positionality again, maybe any bias or stereotypes that you might have, and then really as Klodiana mentioned, like developing a new mindset towards inclusion and thinking about ways to break down those stereotypes and then rebuild from there. And then 5 is teaching and learning approaches. So how diverse are they, and do they offer multiple ways to participate while creating more opportunities for students to demonstrate engagement, learning, generating knowledge? So having a variety of assessments, having options, having flexibility within the structure of your course is always good. And like we noticed when it rapidly shifted to online, if you had that flexibility built in, you might have had an easier time with envisioning ways, or you started to develop that mindset and you can already begin to envision ways of doing an assignment differently if something goes wrong in the course, or a communication breakdown happens with you and your students, or something shifts like it did in March. You might, if you're developing that mindset and that way of thinking about things flexibly and compassionately, then the shift might be a much easier transition in some ways. And then number 6 is classroom climate. So how will you negotiate that culture of learning in your class? And is there an opportunity for cultural production to allow them to express themselves or their culture within the assessments or within discussions or those types of things?
And as Lindsay mentioned, actually having these questions maybe printed out or beside you as you build your course, I think they're a good way to refer to and help you review what you already have in place. The other thing that I want to mention, I don't know if people here are familiar with the Accessible Syllabus project. I think it's a great resource to look into. They talk about inclusive images, they talk about inclusive policies, inclusive rhetoric, and particularly the images resonated really with me, because I remember when I was developing my own course in aging and health, and I was looking for images of older adults, and they were all heterosexual couples walking, holding hands, typically dressed in white. And I looked at it again with a lens of equity and inclusion, and I have to say that they were perpetuating a certain stereotype of how healthy aging looks like. Which was not completely accurate or inclusive. So have a look at it and see if some of the resources that they have there resonate with you.
That's great. And there's also a few frameworks that have been developed for looking at those types of questions and kind of assessing your own social location through an Indigenous lens and an Indigenous framework. So I can provide some links eventually to our CTL at the end of the presentation to our toolkit. It's got some resources there, and we're constantly building those out. And I know very shortly, within the next few days or week or so, there'll be more resources on the Indigenous lens as well. So moving along to the next piece is just how do you model that in that first couple of weeks or so with your students? Well, approach that I've taken to establishing that connection and that understanding, and if I want to do that in an online environment, I've provided my students or helped to co-create grounding rules and guiding principles with them. So this is just a sample of what I've done in different presentations, different webinars, different classroom settings to make sure that it's a safe place, and that if I'm running a sharing circle in an online environment, it's even more important to communicate those rules, because you don't have that ability to look at facial expressions, that ability to kind of feel and read energies in the room and in the space, as I often do in circles. That's kind of how I gauge how people are feeling, and if a topic's sensitive, how I can kind of gauge that we need to address that right away, and then shift gears or refocus and reset ourselves so that microaggressions or things like that don't occur. So this is just a sample, and you can take this and adopt it and adapt it in any way that suits your course as well.
Building on that and what Lindsay was just saying, there are a couple of strategies that perhaps you're already doing or you could be building upon when you think about different components of online learning. And we're starting with asynchronous learning. I don't know how many people here are familiar with this matrix that was created by Daniel Stanford. What this matrix does, it highlights and categorizes different types of asynchronous engagement and synchronous engagement based on bandwidth and immediacy. And immediacy simply refers to how quickly we expect our students to respond when they're interacting with us or when they're interacting with one another. So you can see here, if you have a look at the green zone at the lower quadrant, you'll see that the low immediacy and the low bandwidth, it's students doing readings, emailing and communicating with students via email, or discussion boards that are only text and image based, so no audio, no video. And this one, I know we often take this one for granted, or at least I do, because I don't think it is very exciting. However, when I think about access and inclusion, then this is one of the, these are strategies that, again, require really low bandwidth and require, and very low immediacy. And we need to keep in mind that our students have limited data plans. They might not have access to a laptop, so they might actually follow the entire course through their mobile phones. So how can we leverage and take advantage of some of this low bandwidth and low immediacy opportunities when they fit with our learning outcomes and when they fit with the kind of learning that we intend and we're hoping to promote and encourage. The other quadrant is the blue one. You'll see there it's the collaborative documents and group chat and messaging. So collaborative documents would be things like using Microsoft Teams, using Outlook, Office 365, or Google Docs as a way for students to interact with one another or them to collaborate with us. And group chat and messaging, there are many apps that could be used that, again, require very low bandwidth, but high immediacy. And the other two, the yellow one, it's all the pre-recorded lectures, videos, asynchronous discussions with video and asynchronous discussions with audio. So here you'll see that we're getting at the high bandwidth zone. So for students to watch those pre-recorded videos and engage in those discussions that have audio embedded in them, again, they need to have really good data plans and access and be included that way. And the red zone there, the video conferences and audio conferences is exactly this. So us getting together and connected at a time that, again, requires really good Wi-Fi interactivity and access that way. So something to keep in mind. Again, we've put the reference at the bottom there, so you can read more about the matrix and see, and again, try to align some of the engagements and the activities and the assignments that you have with this framework, if that fits and makes sense to you and resonates with you. So simply, I mean, to say that use asynchronous when possible, and when you're using synchronous engagement, then for what outcomes? So what outcomes could be better addressed synchronously or asynchronously? There are a few other strategies that we've put here. Consider creating a non-academic community discussion board. So I know that in different platforms, I mean, we use OnQ, we also use Elentra in the Faculty of Health Sciences. So we have the discussion board, but quite often they're being used for academic purposes. So students are either responding to guiding questions or they're interacting based on course content. If they consider having a non-academic community discussion board as well, just to give students the space and the place for them to have other conversation based on, again, what's happening on in their lives and feel, again, connected and combat that sense of isolation and loneliness. Create a variety of pathways for UDL. I won't go into that. Lindsay will speak to that, and I know there are a few sessions coming up on UDL as well. But a simple example would be, as you saw at the beginning of the session, we had a message about closed captioning. And closed captioning, we tend to think that it benefits often those people with hearing difficulties, but it also benefits those whose English might not be their primary language. And really, it benefits every other person, and myself included, that actually works in a noisy environment. Again, I'm home with 2 kids, so it is quite noisy. So I benefit as well from closed captioning. So just to say that when we create access for one person, we're creating access for everyone. And the last point I want to make here is scaffolding online learning. And what I mean by that is starting small and really low stakes. So if we start our learning and our course with those, again, small steps, and with engagements, types of engagements and types of assignments that are really low stakes, then we're giving an opportunity to everyone to feel comfortable, to create that sense of community, and then they can build from there.
Perfect, thank you. I'm just going to address a few questions. So David, your question about are your students typically resisting instructor-created forums and creating their own social media closed groups? I've seen this happen too. I teach at the college level. I've seen this happen where they create course-specific or program-specific social media groups where they can share information quickly on Facebook or things like that. So that does happen. There's not really much we can do to prevent that, but just keep encouraging them and keep posting in the own forums that you've created. I found that my students, even though they weren't engaging because they were so busy when it shifted to remote, they weren't engaging and replying back to what I was posting, but they really, really appreciated it because I would post like a 30-second or 1-minute video, just checking in with them, seeing how it's going. I gave them a checklist to get them to the end of the course. This is what you need to focus on to get to the end of the course. And they really, really valued those things, because when they did have time to reach out and connect to me over email, they told me that they really valued that approach, that I was taking kind of like a motivator. I was just motivating them to the end of the course and making sure that they were keeping on track, even though I knew they didn't have time to engage in those discussions fully because they're working on other readings and other priorities.
And Lindsay, if I can add to that,
Sure.
to what you just said, and to the question itself, I think, yes, absolutely. As Lindsay said, I've noticed that as well, that students will engage with social media and other platforms. And you know what? I think it's absolutely fine. And I welcome that. I think part of our role is to model the way and simply creating the space and the place, by telling our students that here are different avenues for engagement. They don't have to take advantage of those. If they prefer different platforms for engagement, that as long that I'm perfectly content with those different platforms, as long as they can see that we as educators have their well-being, have their learning in mind, and we're trying different methods and approaches to promote that. And we're modeled the way by saying, we want you to have those conversations with your peers. We want you to feel safe, and we want you to feel connected to one another and to our community of learning. So if they take advantage of other platforms that are not necessarily in our learning management systems, then I think that's to be encouraged, actually.
Yeah, it shows that they're taking responsibility for their learning, regardless of where that takes place. And then also Kate Robotham had a good point about, so when some students say they're more comfortable in smaller groups, so maybe breaking down and having breakout groups within your discussion boards, or having a little smaller group discussions. I found this with my students too, with a large class of, well, I say large comparatively at college level, it's only maybe 35, but to have a sharing circle with 35 people is overwhelming when you're sharing personal things, or like connections that you're making that could have personal implications. So my students, some of them have said, I'd rather do like smaller sharing circles within our class, like break us up into 4 or 5 smaller sharing circles where we're more comfortable with sharing some things, or working through a certain topic that might be more challenging emotionally, or those types of things. So that's great. So I'll move along to the universal design for learning, and then hopefully we'll create some time for questions and answers at the end as well.
And Lindsay, can I just say how that resonated with me, the point that Kay just made about creating those smaller communities and those smaller groups. As someone who was taught from classes of 10 students to 754 that I co-taught with Anatomy 100, then the only meaningful way to engage this, or one of the most meaningful ways to engage the students, will bringing down in the smaller cohorts, and having them create smaller micro communities of practice. So yes, absolutely, that really resonated with me.
Nice. Yeah. So I will quickly respond to a couple more questions, and then I'll move on to the slide. But yes, I pretty much always do use sharing circles. At least it depends on the content that I'm teaching as well, where that would be something that would happen in every class. A lot of the courses I teach recently have been Indigenous content, so sharing circles are valuable every single class. And it's a good way to develop that community if you're able to make it work, and if it works well with your students. It's scary for students because, as Kathleen kind of ties into Kathleen's point too about having brave rather than safe spaces, when you have a sharing circle, it doesn't always feel safe at first for students that aren't used to that approach, because you're facing each other. You have to speak one at a time, but you're sharing a lot about yourself, and you are looking at people and seeing other people's reactions. So it is a brave space rather than a safe space. I think the difference too between bravery and safety in brave and safe spaces is that with brave, you're also very vulnerable as a facilitator, because you don't know what could come up in conversation. So you have to be equipped with a bunch of things within your toolkit as an educator to handle what might come up. So emotions might come up, anger sometimes comes up, guilt, shame, those types of things. So how can you work through those in a brave space that's also safe? So for me, I've kind of tried to balance safety with bravery, but Also, safety can sometimes prevent you from going to that brave level. It can prevent you from talking about tough issues like residential schools or white or settler guilt and those types of things. But if you also have a brave and a safe space, those conversations can happen quite easily with a little bit of navigation and support from everyone within the circle. Okay, so universal design for learning is the slide that we're on now. So just talking about multiple means of representation, so flexibility in the way information is presented, and then multiple means of action and expression, so different ways to respond or demonstrate knowledge and skills, the how of learning, and then effective networks, so the why of learning, and multiple means of engaging and ways to stimulate interest and motivate learners. So there's different ways of doing the what, the how, the why of learning. And I think the important thing is to know that those are the ways that you can think about it, but also different cultures have different ways of knowing, engaging, and learning, and being in connection and sharing and learning with each other. So often I tell people to not mistake quiet or more reserved students as disengaged, because often from my experience in like reflective journals or assignments where it gives the students that space and that time to think and do things and share, that sometimes the most quiet students are actually the most engaged, and they're actually obtaining and retaining so much of that knowledge that goes on by listening in the class rather than always speaking and voicing. They're listening and they're taking in things and they're making connections in their own space and time. So to value that silence and value those moments of reflection, and the fact that those quieter students are still contributing even though they're not speaking up all the time. So allowing that flexibility to in assignments and delivery models. So allowing that space for students if you can, with like spreading assignments out strategically in the course, or having assessments that are summative as well as formative. So having ones that are 4 marks and ones that maybe aren't, but they're building up to something that is. So giving them chances to try things out and to fail and to make mistakes and then to move forward and learn from them too.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And just to build on that, I mean, we've been talking about this throughout the presentation, and Lindsay alluded to some of those as well. But establishing, now we're moving on to some components of synchronous learning, but establishing some of the rules of engagement for each of these meetings. So what we mean there is really how will the students ask a question when they meet synchronously? What's the approach that you have negotiated to ask a question? How will you engage them? Simply as saying, can everyone see my screen? Does everyone need to type on the chat, yes, we can see your screen, or can they use the reaction features that are in Zoom or any other learning platform that you may be using? So what do those rules of engagement look like in a synchronous learning? What would be acceptable in a synchronous environment? But along with that, it's also that netiquette guide. And I mean, if you need any copies of that, I'm happy to share some of my netiquette guides for the online environment. It really simply highlights how an online classroom is really no different than a traditional classroom. Basically, what would be inappropriate in a traditional classroom would also be inappropriate in an online environment as well. So again, highlighting those different components that will help right up front create that culture of inclusion. The other thing that I want to mention here is, and I was trying to figure it out in Microsoft Teams when logging in, but the other thing, encouraging students to include with their names when they log in their chosen pronouns if they wish, or their pronunciation of their names. And again, I was playing around with Microsoft Teams, but I didn't figure out how to do that, how to put the pronunciation as well. I think it's important. Names are important, and addressing students in their correct names is important as well. So again, things that they can easily do as they log in, or practices that we can encourage as educators when they log in synchronously. Lindsay mentioned silence and how important it is. So how can we create those opportunities for different students to engage rather than privileging one form of engagement over others? And there are certain things that we can do as educators, and one of them would be to, when appropriate, to share questions with students ahead of time. Not everyone, again, will take advantage or will need that, but some students will. Those who like to read them before and reflect on the questions and even have that feeling that they're prepared and they can contribute, I think it will make a difference in the engagement in the synchronous learning. Number 3 here, be intentional on how you start and end the session. So in a face-to-face environment, there are certain signals that are present when we start learning, when we start teaching, or when the teaching is done. And then typically when we're done, we'll close our computer, the screen is off, and students will start packing and getting ready. Or when they come in, they will have their conversations in the hallway about how their weekend was and things like that. So there are those, again, practices that do not necessarily happen in an organic way in an online environment. So having a routine on how you start and end the session, I think will be beneficial long term. We talked about building in reflection time and being comfortable with silence. We talked about that as well. I mean, I explicitly tell my students, I am very comfortable with silence, and I'll actually wait. I give them a time limit. I'll wait 30 seconds or a minute. So feel free to write things down, and then we'll open it up for questions. We talked about ensuring that resources meet basic accessibility requirements. Again, if they can't access the resource, they won't be able to engage. And the last one, modeling ways of being in an online environment. So, and that goes with creating that trust and that safe space, but also, as Lindsay mentioned, being equipped and prepared on navigating those difficult conversations. And as an example, I mean, even talking about or asking students about how they're coping, or COVID-19, taking that as an example, it might actually hit too close to home for some students. So you don't want them to feel sad or vulnerable that actually will prevent their learning. So choosing alternative examples, or providing some trigger warnings and being ready to navigate some difficult conversations that might come up as you are meeting synchronously. Lindsay, is there anything else that we want to mention about synchronous learning? I'm sure all of you are using your own strategies, and I would love to hear what they are. Unfortunately, I only have the screen open, so I can't follow the chat, but I'm sure, Lindsay, you can tell me.
Yeah, no, I think I would like to just follow up on your point about having sensitive topics. I mean, teaching Indigenous courses, foundational courses, there's a lot of feelings that come up. There's a lot of mental health issues or re-traumatization that can occur when you're talking about residential schools. You're talking about colonization and the history and everything that's happened. And so for my own development and kind of it just happened that I've been in many student-facing roles where I've been a student success facilitator. I've taken on some mental health training specific to trauma-informed care. I've really developed myself in those ways of also being able to support my students holistically as well. And I realize not everyone has that background, and not everyone's, you're not expected to, but I've found it extremely valuable and helpful as an educator to help support myself in navigating those things, but also helping to support my students with those as well.
That's a great point, Lindsay, becoming familiar with the mental health resources and actually which ones are available through remote access and 24/7. And I often say, rather than connecting people to services, connect them to people. So perhaps going the extra step and finding out who the person is, or who are the people supporting those students in those areas, and maybe you can connect them to those people directly. Yeah, for sure. I am mindful of time, but I think we don't have a lot left here because we do want to leave some room for questions, even though some questions have been coming in as we present. And we do want to leave some room to share some of the resources if you're interested to read further, and our contacts as well, so you can always reach out to us. But something that we'd like to highlight is that really inclusive pedagogy and practice is not a quick checklist. I mean, we have developed handbooks and guides and guiding questions that that could help either invite students or invite yourself for a self and critical reflection in terms of some of the practices and routines that you already have in place. Instead, bringing this lens of ED&I to everything that we do, it really means that we are noticing all the individual and social differences in the environment, and we're being mindful to our own identity, our own assumptions, and we continue to remain curious and continue to unlearn as well as we learn. It also means that we're open, reflective, and reflexive as instructors and model this mindset for the students.
Yeah, I think that's great, Klodiana, and I would echo that too. Is just that inclusion, even decolonization and indigenizing, and all of those, reconciliation, all of those things are really a mindset. And so that mindset is like, it's almost like a muscle. You have to continually work it. You have to build upon it. You have to strengthen it, support it in any way that you can. And as an educator, that means constantly learning, as often we are as educators anyway. We're learners too, and to continually adapt and adopt and learn new things and try new practices and be willing to flex and bend when needed, I think is so important. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for attending. We'll go through our resources and share those with you, those slides, and then we'll also be sending out the slide deck to you, all of you that are in here today. And then also a survey will be following up as well in that email. And if you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to complete that and let us know how we did today, what other topics you might want to see covered in future sessions, or what we can maybe add to in our toolkit at the CTL.
Mm-hmm. And before we go to the resources, something that you reminded me, Lindsay, is actually admitting what I've learned over the years is admitting my own mistakes and showing my own vulnerability with the students, and that can go a long way. If the chances are there are things that I'll do wrong, and saying that that was a mistake, how can we work together? That has been appreciated. The other thing is I've become much more purposeful and intentional when I ask feedback from the students, and specifically using the terms inclusion and diversity and how it's being promoted in our classroom. So I ask them to simply fill into sentences, keeping inclusion and diversity. How has this class promoted this? Then fill in the blanks. I like, and how about. So that has been sort of an easy way for me to get some feedback on how I'm modeling some of these practices as an educator. So one of the resources that we do want to mention, it's the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, in our pedagogy and in our practice. And I co-led this project with the Human Rights and Equity Office, and there have been many people involved. Educators from the CTL have been involved. We had a teaching and advisory group who has helped us. We had a research associate. So it's been a labor of love and a long process, but I am proud of the product. And there are 5 different modules that I'm hoping will resonate with you. They're on different topics: power, privilege, and bias, conversations on decolonization. And there you'll find some interviews that we did with students and faculty members at Queen's, navigating difficult conversations, inclusive and responsive teaching, and an entire module on UDL. So it's a great resource if you want to explore further. I would suggest definitely looking at this ones. There are other resources that we've either cited in the presentation or other components, and some you'll see they're really dimensions of inclusive design, some guidebooks and handbooks of inclusive design, and some of these are through the Faculty of Health Sciences, but I also know that the CTL has wonderful resources as well, and you'll find them in the next slide here. So Lindsay, you were mentioning the...
Yeah, so we have a transforming teaching toolkit where there's actually a section on classroom community. There's a section on inclusion. I'm building out all the time resources on indigenizing and decolonizing, and we have existing resources on the CTL page around that as well. But new things are being added every single week, so it's good to check back and also maybe subscribe to our bulletin, so you can always get in touch with us regarding or see what events we have coming up, webinars, different things like that. And they're also listed always on our schedule page, our programming page on the CTL website too.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad that Lindsay mentioned getting in touch. We put our emails here, so feel free if there is anything we said during the talk or that resonated with you, or actually prompt you to think further or think differently, or you'd like us to think differently about a particular area. I mean, I welcome those comments and those conversations, so please do get in touch. We're certainly open to that. And like I said, this personally is an area that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm fully invested in it. So I welcome any learnings alongside all of you. We do have, Lindsay, do we have 5 minutes for questions?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left if there's any final thoughts or questions.
So maybe what I can try and do, I can maybe stop sharing my screen so I can see some of the comments.
Looks like it's mostly thank yous rolling in, and that's much appreciated too. Thank you so much. And we will be sharing out the slides, so they will have those links on them too. And like I said, always check back at the CTL website to check out our programming schedule too. Yeah, you can stop recording, Caitlin. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.